Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us. Our webinar is now beginning. I'm Steve Love. I'm President and CEO of the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council, and we have another educational webinar today, hosted in conjunction with Konica Minolta, who is a very active associate member of the DFW Hospital Council. Today's topic, cybersecurity awareness. Think like an attacker. This is a hot topic. We all know that, especially in healthcare. And we've had recent events of cyber hacking issues in hospitals throughout the nation. Today, we have a national expert, and we're looking forward to his presentation. You know, we have worked with Konica Minolta now for over a decade. They have been a really supporting associate member, bringing business solutions, technology, IT services, and they have been a valued friend of the Hospital Council. So we're delighted to do this webinar in conjunction with them. You know, we really want to help this webinar bring to you some of the things that you can identify related to weaknesses, how the bad guys, so to speak, gain access and they escalate privileges and then they compromise your systems. Today, our guest speaker is a national expert, Jake Reynolds. He's Offensive Securities Director with Depth Security. He has over 20 years experience and leads the security assessment practice at Konica Minolta. His depth security team delivers expert web and mobile applications, security assessments, penetration testing, and enterprise risk assessments for customers ranging in size from small businesses to Fortune 100 companies. We're looking forward to his presentation. We always want to take your questions, but we ask one favor. Please type them in the question box or the chat box. And when Jake finishes his presentation, he's going to answer those questions. So it's my privilege and pleasure to now turn this over to Mr. Jake Reynolds.
Thanks for the warm introduction, Stephen, and I appreciate the invite to be on, as well as everyone's time today. So like the slide says, we're going to talk about the offensive perspective of things, which is kind of helpful. I've worked in, all facets of IT, including on the blue team defense side, and sometimes it's nice to know kind of how the enemy operates. And my goal today would be to go through some real life scenarios about how we've breached health organizations in various ways, but not just talk about that. After each scenario, we'll talk about some of the things that could have stopped us along the way. So I hope that you get some value in this. And like Stephen said, any questions you have in the chat, if you happen to see someone besides me answering them while I talk, I've also got a few of my top operators on the call with us that make me look, a little less talented. So I'm pretty proud of them. We'll have a Q&A at the end that I can address anything that still needs addressed as well. So with that, little brief agenda, we're going to go over just a quick couple slides about what depth security is and who I am. Then we're going to get into, like I said, real kill chains against health related vertical companies. These could be health systems like a lot of you all are from, could be health service providers, developers of health applications. We consider it kind of all the same, even though each one does something different and they do it differently. More importantly than, how cool it is when you break into a healthcare org, I really want to focus on each of the chains, each of the scenarios along the steps. We'll follow up with what could have stopped this? What could you put into play that may have given us a hard time, et cetera. So hopefully that's valuable and we can cover anything else in the questions. So about depth security, just really quickly, I founded Debt Security in '06 with two other partners. We grew that business and eventually sold to Konica Minolta in 2020. We just passed about the 5.5 year mark post acquisition, and that has gone very smoothly. Our office is still in Kansas City, Missouri. I have testers all over the country, but all testers are US based and full-time employees. A lot of firms like ours flex out to outsource, do various quality individuals to cover their work when they run out of resources, but we strictly don't do that. We're focused on offensive, so think pen testing, red teaming. Our whole thing is to show you how far something can lead and what you could do to stop it along the way, and how serious it could be for your business. We're on the same team. We're super empathetic about defenders. I tell every one of my operators, it's so much harder to defend an organization than it is to attack. That asymmetry kind of like defines the space, I think. I feel like there's more risk for me attempting to rob a bank by about 10,000 than there is of me getting caught breaching the largest companies on earth from the comfort of my own home through a VPN or something. And to us, we'd like to change that. Obviously, that's a problem. We work with you. We're not against you. We're trying to find and improve these serious bugs. And a lot of times that can help you drive additional budget to prioritize things that have been put on the back burner that you all tend to know is a problem. Sometimes a third party's perspective on a particularly catastrophic breach, where the good guys find it before the less scrupulous individuals do, to ransomware you or something like that, can move executives' minds. I'm most proud of the team here. It's the most thoughtful, competent, serious group of individuals I've ever worked with at any organization. And it's probably a testament to Konica that they've allowed us to continue that way, as acquisitions don't always go that way. We're small, focused, effective, and our take's always quality over quantity. A little bit about me. Again, one of former owners. Now I'm the director of offensive here at AC. I do the same thing I did when I owned the company, just with a boss now. And I'm a husband and a dad. I have 3 kids at various pretty close ages, and a golden doodle named Brutus. Background-wise, I've held a lot of different certifications at some point. Most of them lapsed as I've progressed through my career, and I've done everything from laptop tech to owning a company to working defense, offense. But the last 20 years of my career have been offensive entirely, from pen tester myself to running teams of pen testers to owning a pen testing company and running the team. I've kind of seen a wide variety, I'd say. Like I said, just celebrated our 5-year anniversary last July for the acquisition. Hobbies wise, I'm a big gym guy, anything with a motor. Grew up riding motocross. I love anything like that. And I, late in life, learned to snowboard. So that's been something I've enjoyed teaching my kids and doing once or twice a year. So that out of the way. Story time, right? So these are all health targeted operations. These are recent, not something I've cherry picked over 20 years of working. These are all things that have happened within a year or so. I kept the stories oriented towards what I'd call catastrophic external sourced breaches. So, the perspective is someone coming to get you with no prior knowledge of your organization, a home invasion, if you will, right? There's other different perspectives. Obviously, phishing and social engineering is a valid vector. But I'll give you the insider knowledge on phishing, which is from an attacker perspective, it's a lot easier to get credentials from a phishing victim than it is to run code and exploit their box directly. So even if you're worried about phishing, a lot of these scenarios start with us compromising a user and a password, which is kind of essentially where a successful phish will start once they convince somebody to send them their username and password. These are generic enough that they actually apply anywhere, not just health. And there are so many to choose from. I don't want you to think these are rare by any means. I think the takeaway here is that we breach health orgs the same way we breach most targets. There's not a lot of difference in TTPs. Every one of these TTPs has worked against non-health orgs as well. And I think the difference for health, as we're very aware, we have a lot of health clients, is consequences are life and death. There's life critical systems that, if impacted, are directly connected to individuals that need them to stay alive. And we're always really aware of that when we test hospital systems, especially. Where, other verticals have similar attributes like, operational technologies in manufacturing. We've compromised blast furnaces and things like that could hurt people. But health systems are full of these things, and you're having the burden of, often them being unpatchable, stuck on certain firmwares, they can't be updated. And so we're a little bit aware of some of the trouble of running defense at a health org. Just generally, the things we're going to be talking about, like I said, we're going to stay away from social engineering and phishing. For us, we do that. We're not as passionate about tricking people into doing things. It's probably just our ethos and personal preference. We're way more impressed when we can compromise an organization remotely, pivot, go internal, get to domain admin, control every server, every user, all that, without ever having stepped foot in the office or sent an email to anyone or relied on anyone clicking a link. So these are the kinds of scenarios that would keep me awake at night defending a health org. And they boil down to basically 4 categories. So just straight up exploitable vulnerabilities. We're going to talk about how this worked with a particular web app. We've got an example about a mobile app as well, how we were able to use it as a foothold. A lot of what we talk about is going to come down to password hygiene and MFA weaknesses, which I think is pretty interesting. So we have I think a unique take on what you may have as far as preconceived notions. We're going to talk about, stored secrets in general deployment weaknesses. And then in some of these scenarios, we are able, if the client rules of engagement allow it, to go ahead and pivot internally and take the attack from, something that may be a devastating personal health information disclosure to completely owning an internal health org network with that complete admin control over everything. So getting into it. So this one's it's a health system, and it's an external breach through a web app. Again, we're coming at this company with no credentials, no idea other than they've told us, we know their domain, maybe we know their target IP addresses, and we're going to do our worst, right, and try to write this up. So the first thing we did is we found an unlinked API endpoint on an exposed web app. What I mean by unlinked is if you visit the page of the web app, there's nothing that points this out. But if you use a dictionary of common file names and spray that at the web server, you come across this endpoint, and it just dumps a list of every username. Well, we take that list, and we notice that there's no account lockout, right, on the web app. So kind of unusual. We're going to take advantage of that to password spray. You'll see the word password spray, PW spray, and I'm just going to go over it right now because I don't want you to think I'm brute forcing a user account, right? Just think of it this way. If I have one user account and I'm trying to guess passwords, even without account lockout, I have infinite tries. It's very unlikely I'm going to guess your password. But if I have 1,000 user accounts that are all valid and a list of them, I can guess that one of them for sure is going to be winner with a capital W, 2025 dollar, or company name $123. Within 10 attempts, I can definitely get an account. So that's what we did. And we came across one compromised account. We were able to guess one of those usernames that it just gave us with a password that was guessable. And this account was unregistered, right? And by that, I mean, you get a valid session in the app, but nobody's approved the user yet. So none of the functionality really works. So we're a little farther along, but we can't probe the app or really see what it does yet until someone on the back end registers this thing. So we use that valid session to find another endpoint. And this one, it's not something you'd come across in the web app, but if you guess the name, you get it. And it allowed, with the valid session, since we'd logged in with the unregistered user, a list of every user, just like the first one, but this one came with password hashes. So password hashes is the way you store passwords rather than in clear text. It's a one-way function. If I get the hash, I have to crack it on a password cracking rig. So we have a custom password cracking rig here full of NVIDIA GPUs that can attempt billions of passwords per second against a list of infinite users. It doesn't, it's very fast, and we're able to crack several dozen of these user password hash pairs, right? So once we saw we had success in clear text passwords and accounts, we logged into the app, and this one was a registered user, so we could look at the application's functionality and see what was around. One of the first things we're going to do is there a way to upload files? Is there a way to download files? Stuff that might reach the OS and get us further along. And we found a PDF download feature. Should be common in most of the apps that we're familiar with. You can do some type of an export to a PDF. So the thing with PDF creation software is they can suffer from vulnerabilities just like anything. They may just be a little harder to find. As you see, we had to go through all this effort just to get authenticated to see that they were creating PDFs. And so we downloaded one, and the first thing we do is we look at the metadata in the PDF. And the metadata of the PDF will often disclose the PDF generation libraries and versions, right? And we could just Google that and say, oh, are there any cool vulnerabilities in this software that might allow us to do something outside the bounds of what the app was intending us to do? And there were. And a common way that you exploit PDF engines is if you can control the content it uses to generate the PDF, sometimes you can point it to a local file. And if the vulnerable PDF engine retrieves the file and prints it as a PDF, then you can pull things like settings files, right, which may contain credentials. And in this case, they did. We pulled an app settings file, and it contained a Microsoft Entra connection string. All that means is here's the database, here's the username, here's the password. So at this point, we've broken into the app with a pretty crude password spray. They didn't have account lockout, so that helped. And found a PDF generation library that was vulnerable, pulled credentials the app was using on the back end to log into its database with Entra. And then we reuse those Entra on other edge-facing services, like where else are these valid, right? So we got into M365, and we were able to enroll in Duo to get MFA. That allowed us access to Outlook, SharePoint, et cetera. And again, we had a dozen users, and you'll see it says testing stopped, right? So when we test, we don't decide how far we go. The client does. So you'll see various levels of where we could have kept going and made this more interesting, but we take the client's word for it that they understand the risk. At this point, they don't want us to waste any more time and to continue on finding new things. So now we're going to walk through that as far as like what would have stopped that. And you'll see a resounding number one. A little bit of a bias here since we're a pen testing company, but just want to point out that application pen testing found this before it was exploited. So no harm, no foul on this organization for having these bugs out there, because they did the due diligence, got a qualified firm in, found it, buttoned it up, and now it's not a problem for them. The second thing, there shouldn't have been any endpoints we could hit that would disclose the whole username list without us logging in. It's probably not even a good idea to disclose all those when you do log in if you have any way of avoiding it. Strong password security policies like account lockout would have made this a little bit more difficult, right? It won't stop us, but it'll slow us down where we can just go kind of crazy with our attempts and buzz through a ton of passwords on that list. With account lockout, we have to queue our scanning so that it doesn't go so fast as to cause a lockout. Attackers won't care about this, but we care because we're not here to do a pen test and make you look bad or deny service to anyone, especially at a health org. So it's something to keep in mind. Any sensitive app should have an account lockout mechanism. Again, avoid any endpoints that just dump a list of usernames. Just plain usernames are dangerous enough, but responding with password hashes, there shouldn't be any reason to do that. An unregistered user like we had should not have been able to call that API where we retrieve the hashes. So that's just authorization. This is getting into the weeds here, but they used unsalted hashes, which meant that it was a lot easier to crack them on our cracking rig than if they would have used an appropriate salt, which makes us do a compute per user and per hash versus being able to do it in parallel. So using cryptography right when you're having to, avoiding cryptography when you can, because it's hard and there are specialists in that. Inventory and manage security updates on all software. So if you think about this, that PDF generation library probably wasn't jumping out on anyone's radar. It's buried inside this app, but it was vulnerable, and we kind of showed the results of that. Avoid storing secrets like entracreds and clear text if you can. Figure out a secure enclave, or better yet, use app-specific keys rather than a username and password for your apps if they integrate into your Entra or Okta or any identity provider. You notice we were able to enroll in Duo with a username and password. If you allow Duo or MFA enrollment with a username and password on the public internet, you're essentially, invalidating MFA because we didn't need MFA to get to MFA. And finally, there's this feature called risk-based sign-in with Entra. In this case, they used Entra, so there shouldn't have been any reason to not use risk-based sign-in, where it's evaluating, the history of that login. Why did it come from this new IP? Why did it come from this new machine, et cetera? And that might have helped prevent us as well. Moving on. Okay, so that last one was a web app. This one was a mobile app, something you'd download from the, Apple App Store or Google Play. Most of these have versions in both. So this first line sounds really complicated, but what we do to evaluate these is we set up a proxy in between the mobile phone and the app's endpoint so that we can see the HTTP requests and responses. And that gets us in a position to see what's going on when you click login, what format is it and where does it go, how can we alter it, things like that. So we found, the first thing we did is looked at in the proxy, where does the login go, what format is it, because we want to password spray it. And kind of already explained password spraying. We're going to start the same way on this mobile app. So this one was even worse on an account hygiene perspective. So the app didn't allow password changes. There was no password complexity enforcement. There was no lockout and no MFA. Equals we were likely to succeed with any decent sized list of users in our password spray. So we succeeded. That gained us access to log into this mobile app, and now kind of the world's our oyster. Continuing to move through that app, observing those requests and responses in proxy, we noticed a couple endpoints that jumped right out at us, and they used IDORs. That's just a fancy word of saying insecure direct object reference, and it's pretty easily explainable. If you have an API endpoint with a query that says document equals 1, 2, 3, 4, I'm immediately going to use a tool called burp intruder and fuzz values 1 through 10,000. And since integers often iterate from 1, it gives us a pretty easy iterable way to see, is there authorization enforced? We found out it wasn't, so we were able to just, whether it was our patient or not for this account or our health system or not, retrieve driver's licenses, health imaging, notes, some of the most sensitive stuff that if it were public, it would just be a bad look. The type of thing you don't want to get in the news for. Same thing with patient. We saw patient equals a number. So we just iterated that number through what we thought would be logical values from 1 to 10,000 or so. And that just gave us a giant, as much as we want, list of patient names, social security numbers, addresses, and more. So all PHI, all bad news. You know, there's I'm sure fines and fees and that kind of thing associated with having this stuff exposed in any way if it becomes public. Now, part two of this is we weren't stopped there. The client was amicable to keep going, and it makes sense here. So we found what's called a stored XSS in the messaging feature. All that means is that I can, by way of sending a message to somebody, I can embed a little JavaScript payload in there that can do something I want it to do, so that when another user views it, it just automatically runs the JavaScript and does whatever that thing is. One of the things you do with XSS is you store a little piece of code that just anyone that sees that message, it automatically sends us their session cookie. And that sounds complicated, but a session cookie is as good as a username and password if it's logged into, because once you send your username and password through a mobile app, you don't keep sending it in every request. You get a session cookie back, and then that thing acts as a token for you until it expires or you log out. So with that stored XSS, sending a message to an admin, the admin views the message as they would, and our payload fires their session cookie to us, where we catch it on our public web server. All we do is put that into the mobile client, and now we're them. So it's a user impersonation issue. Testing stopped at this point. It was just a mobile app account, a mobile app pen test, and we demonstrated some pretty cool stuff here. So, different threats, different target. It's a mobile app as opposed to a web app last time. Again, my number one is they bothered to employ a qualified firm that was really going to dig into this, and they did mobile app pen testing before it was exploited. So they got away from any damage this might have caused from us finding it first and relaying, this is how you should go about fixing this. Now, that said, you have a lot of commercial software that you didn't develop, and in our opinion, you shouldn't be on the hook for paying for expensive pen testing on. So I always tell people, and folks usually don't take me up on this, but from your vendors, try to request any testing results that you have gotten from them. Sometimes you can see a lot about who you're dealing with and doing business with based on their response, on how open they are to providing that. Did they give you anything? Do they give you a redacted report? Or is it, can you tell it's a client-facing report with all the details removed? I've got there, your mileage may vary here, prepare to be depressed, but I think it's worth asking for. And as a firm, for any of our clients, we're always willing to take a look, if they want to give it to us, of prior work that's done. And we can usually tell them that, yeah, this looks like a good test, or no, this doesn't look like a good test, and here's why. So that may be of use. If you have a trusted pen testing provider and you happen to have something from a commercial app that has been tested, you may want to bounce that off of them. Hey, what's this test look like to you all, et cetera. We could have enforced account lockout here, just basic login mechanisms to limit password spraying. Could have done password complexity enforcement on all users. Could have enforced MFA on this app. Granted, what it had access to, I think it warrants MFA for the app. Finally, there shouldn't have been any reason that any user should access any patient ID, or any user should access any document ID. And that's just basic authorization. Even if I ask for a valid patient ID, the app should check my session and go, this is Jake from hospital X. He's not supposed to access this patient from hospital Y, just as an example, right? And don't unnecessarily respond with full unmasked SSNs if at all possible. If the last four are appropriate for the job function, do that. Just imagine how much less of an issue it would be if this got breached by somebody other than us and it was not full SSNs. It's a slight help. And then for the account takeover, that XSS I mentioned, You should always sanitize user input. In this case, it was a message to another user. And there's also a way to, when you render that, to safely encode it so that the mobile app doesn't interpret it as JavaScript. As well as that cookie we stole, there's a specific attribute to prevent this called HTTP only. It costs you nothing to put on your session cookies. And it will, when JavaScript tries to access that cookie to send it off to a bad guy, it'll say, nope, that's not how this works. So those are like, along the way, that's what they could have done. And that's what we recommended in the report. Obviously kind of, you could stop the whole thing by preventing the password spray. That said, there'd be these underlying vulnerabilities that weren't discovered if we wouldn't have broken in to find them. So I guess the key is like number 3 and 4 could have stopped the whole thing. And the rest of it's, you're starting to fight the battle deeper into the attack, right? So away from applications, more on full network pen testing, right? Where we're given, an entire organization's perimeter and said, okay, let's find all the vulnerabilities, see what's serious enough to chain up with others and get as far as we can. So on this one, we used public breaches for clues on an email format. When breaches happen, it may not be you, but it may be LinkedIn, and your employees may be using their company email address, possibly even their company password, to just use it on these third-party services, which they're informed not to, but they do anyway. A lot of times these individuals have their machines infected with what's called stealers, and these aggregate all the cool secrets and usernames and passwords on their machines, send them to a broker. They get sold on the dark web. And then we're subscribed to several, dark web threat intel feeds that allow us to, if we know your DNS domain, I can find every compromised user account and the password, as well as any other info that's in there. I think everyone's worried about passwords and compromised breaches. But again, if you think about the password spraying tips I gave you, the username list is just as valid to us. Because once we can get, again, that list of 10,000 potentially valid usernames or emails, now I'm really likely to hit within 10 guesses on some really common password values. So again, that's how we got the username list here. We do other things like scrape LinkedIn, using Google to find anything. Sometimes employee directories are gold mines. We're really after usernames because we're pretty confident in our abilities to guess one of their passwords if we get a sufficiently large list of users. So we took that user list, and on their network was an NTLM authentication endpoint. Don't get bogged down in the acronym NTLM or whatever. The significance is that this endpoint authenticated to internal Active Directory, and it also gave us the internal Active Directory name so that we could format our login requests during the spray correctly. So we did a little bit more open source intelligence gathering past the public breaches to get as many potential usernames in that dictionary for our spray as possible. We validated them against M365 using a tool called OneDrive enum. It'll basically fire them all off at Microsoft, and Microsoft will tell us whether they're valid or not. And when disclosed to Microsoft, they say usernames aren't a security issue. We don't consider that a bug, but Microsoft keeps us in business because of that type of mindset they have. So, I think a lot of this is driving home the danger of even exposing usernames, which you aren't in control of. So you kind of have to move one level down and think about password hygiene and MFA. So now we had a completely validated list of usernames. We knew based on that OneDrive enum, we trimmed all the invalid ones out, so we're not wasting our time when we spray. And then we sprayed against M365 and gained some credentials through password spraying. One of the first things we did there is try to log into the Azure management portal. And the reason we want to do that is because the management portal, if you make the mistake of allowing just low privilege users to get to it, it will allow us to download an entire username list that's fully by inherency just validated, and then we can spray with that and get more accounts compromised in case we need them. But when we tried to log into Azure Management Portal, we found there was what's called a conditional access policy preventing login, and those are things rules that say, okay, when you're logging into the management portal, if it's not Windows and it's not OS X, deny it. But what people miss is sometimes there's not an implicit deny at the bottom, and that we can often spoof a user agent, maybe make it Chromebook or some kind of mobile device, and just due to the incorrectness of we call it a CAP, conditional access policy, the thing slides to the bottom and gets accepted. So we bypassed that, tried to log into the management portal again. We ran into a posture check where they do a little bit more digging on your endpoint to see if you're allowed to log in. And we've done this before where we actually see where that check's going. And there's a vulnerability there in that if you just take that endpoint name that it's trying to send the check to, you put it in your host file and point it to a bogus address, the thing fails open. So we were able to bypass that second login check. Again, already had usernames and passwords, but had to go through a couple more hoops to eventually get that management portal. And then, like I alluded to earlier, we just use that to download the entire user base from Azure. So then we take that username list and we want to just do another password spray to get more accounts. We found 2 more accounts. They were not MFA enrolled. We are able to use a insecure public MFA enrollment to enroll our own device in MFA. Once we had MFA, we were going to go straight to Citrix because we'd already tested it with a username and password and got prompted for MFA and stopped. But now we had MFA, so we were able to log into their public, again, all internet facing, their Citrix server. Now in Citrix, there's so many bypasses that if you can avoid using it, I would. Sometimes we're stuck with these things for legacy reasons, but in Citrix, we just simply, right-clicked something that was a published app to get a file explorer open. We were able to go down to the directory that contains PowerShell.exe. It wouldn't let us open that, but Citrix is so weird that if you rename PowerShell.exe to not PowerShell.exe, all of a sudden you can open it in this case. So that's how these things work. That's why I say try to avoid Citrix if you can. Definitely pen test it if you have apps published in it. When we opened that PowerShell, it gave us the ability to basically open a reverse proxy back to our listener. And that sounds complicated. All that does is create a conduit from that internal network to our attacking box, where we can now pipe our tooling straight to the internal juicy center of the network behind the firewalls. And now the world opens up for us as far as attacks. It's almost like when an attacker gets this far of a sophistication level like ours, not that we're a nation state or anything like that, we're just a bunch of people testing. Now we can start to attack the internal network where it's super vulnerable by nature, more services are open. And so we started proxying tooling into the internal network and did a check on one of the numerous accounts we'd password sprayed, found that it was a member of Active Directory server admins. Now, you might as well be in full control of the entire Active Directory at this point. If server admins doesn't have domain admin privileges, it has system on every server. So we can hit every server and extract all credentials from memory. And one of those is going to be a domain admin. But they were satisfied that we gotten this far in this case with the rules of engagement, what they were, testing stopped. Lessons learned on this one, right? Again, did an external network pen test, and not just, a scan sold to you as a pen test, but the real deal where we're actually putting our hearts and minds and thoughts into this and trying as hard as possible to show you something. And again, this was identified and fixed before anyone exploited it, saving them, whatever that would have been in face publicly, as well as, fees and things like that that might have been imposed. That NTLM endpoint, that's kind of a legacy thing. So if you have those hanging around, try to remove them. Anything like that that authenticates to Active Directory, it's pretty easy for us to spray, and the success of those sprays are different than in the web app I talked about earlier, because if I get an Active Directory credential, it's probably valid in many places on your perimeter, in this case Citrix as well. So we weren't interested in that NTL endpoint. It just served as a great place to spray passwords. Strong security policies and account lockout mechanisms. If you possibly can, we all think about complexity like length, number of special characters, capitalization, alphanumeric. What's really important is password ban listing. So the ability to prevent someone from having your your hospital name $123 is a common one we see, or anything that has summer, winter, fall. All the valid passwords that we see that are, more numerous than others. I have a pretty good parlor trick that if I can get 20 people at a party, I don't ever volunteer this, but it'll eventually come out that, yeah, Jake does cybersecurity, et cetera. And I get challenged with like, oh yeah, how do you break into networks? And I'll say, well, I can probably guess one of your passwords close enough that someone here will cringe. And I'll start rattling off with 5 or 10, and eventually a couple people will start to look real sheepish, and it works every time. It's pretty funny. Again, risk-based sign-in with Entra ID. Might have caught that, we're coming from a non-standard IP, non-standard endpoint. Check those conditional access policies out if you have them. Make sure there's no slip-throughs or weird, logic in them that we might be able to guess. Disable Microsoft admin portals like Entra Admin and things like that for general users if possible. Those should be for your admin accounts only. Usually there's probably another workaround if your users need access to that. So you can strip rights and permissions and make this harder for us if we do happen to get a general user account through password spraying. Again, they allowed public self-enrollment with just a user and password for MFA, rather than, a unique link that goes to your inbox, and you'd have to have it plus your username and password, or maybe a pre-shared key that you take a username, password, and your mobile number, social security number, employee ID, something like that. And it fails if you don't have all 3 pieces. Anything but just a username and password, because you can see how easy they are to get in our case. And I've said this before, there's more Citrix shell escapes than there are mitigations. You can try and harden it. We have yet to come across one that we couldn't get past. So avoid it or secure it thoroughly. Put it behind a VPN, number of things you can do there. And then, implement EDR to catch anything malicious. So I want you to note EDR is better than it's ever been. During the antivirus years, we were able to run things at will without worries of being stopped. We wouldn't even disable McAfee or whatever, Symantec, like it just wouldn't catch stuff. And we live in an age of Microsoft Defender, SentinelOne, CrowdStrike. These are things everyone should have if you have the budget for it. But you do need to know that they don't really bother us a whole lot once we're this far in with 50 valid accounts and any number of systems we could have as backups once you think you've blocked us here or there. It's a cat and mouse game, just like the military. You don't fight battles behind the wire. You go out forward of the base and fight them out there. Same applies to cybersecurity. I know we all take an assumed breach mentality, but that doesn't mean you need to give up your edge and let them in. Next one, another health service provider. So this one, we used a sales tool called Zoom Info. It's very expensive, but it's for salesmen hunting down contacts to cold call like we all get, cold outreach and email. Well, we use that to pull down email addresses to give us that raw username dictionary we're going to use in a spray. Again, I mentioned LinkedIn. There's a tool we use called LinkedIn. There's probably 10 of these tools. LinkedIn keeps trying to change their pages so that you can't scrape them, but there's always a new tool update as soon as they do that allows us to just buzz through your organization, and any people associated with it, we can then take their first name and last name and compose the username, as long as we know it's first dot last or something like that. Now we take that raw list of maybe good, maybe bad usernames, and again, we ran OneDrive enum to get a pure, valid, known valid list of usernames before we start to waste our efforts on invalid ones. And at that point, the spray commenced. And the thing to keep on in mind about sprays is when you do have account lockout, remember I mentioned we don't just hammer and lock accounts out. We'll run them over the course of the entire test. And for days on end, low and slow, 1 password per user account per hour type stuff. So we can fly below the radar of account lockout. It just slows us down. In this case, we had no success. We happened to come across a web app that authenticated to internal AD as opposed to like Entra and M365. And that's where we know where we went wrong with the spray and why we weren't getting any success. Because when we did a login in this web app, we noticed there was a difference in timing in the response between when a valid user was guessed and an invalid password, and an invalid username and password were guessed. It would respond quicker because the lookup didn't time out for a valid user. When you guessed an invalid user, it would respond much later. So all we were able to do is buzz through our raw list, sort by response time, and there was a huge dividing line between the valids and invalids due to that timing difference. So now again, you'll see the theme where we've got a valid, completely validated, known good list of usernames, and we can, start to spray. Well, we noticed that this list that we ended up with had a different format than, the M365 stuff we were spraying against, which was first dot last. So we were able to compose that together, figured it out. We sprayed that app with the finally, corrected username list after kind of a miss attempt, and compromised multiple accounts. This app, again, used no MFA and allowed login. In that app, it was sensitive enough that the attack could have stopped here and been bad enough. Myriad sensitive customer info here alone, all PHI. But in that app, they did another thing where they kind of disclosed the username list of the app in one feature or another. So we grabbed that, and we tried to spray them with great success. So now we've got multiple usernames and accounts. And from there, just like the others, okay, we're done with this app. Where else are these things valid on the perimeter of this health service provider? And so we tried M365 and VPN. We could log in, but we'd get prompted for MFA. So we were halfway there. This was push-based MFA, where you just get a little badge on your watch or your phone and hit approve. So we tried a technique called push fatigue, where we send one out, maybe they don't hit accept. We try one 3 minutes later. They're in a meeting, getting a little annoyed. They hit deny. We try another one 3 minutes later, and now it's their turn to talk in the meeting, and they're like, all right, whatever's going on, hit accept, whatever. Works a good chunk of the time, but this time it didn't. So some user was out there being a human firewall, doing the right job. We would notate that in the report. We figure you got to probably give people accolades as much as we come down on them for failing phishing tests. It's just as important to call the folks out that are doing the right thing and say, hey, that's exactly what we want out of everyone, make an example out of them in a good way. So we had, of those breached credentials, there was a single one that was unenrolled, and again allowed us to self-service enroll in MFA publicly with just that username and password. So we got MFA enrolled for the user and found out that it wasn't assigned to M365 or VPN roles. So we couldn't scrape the inbox, go check out SharePoint for usernames and passwords and documents and cool stuff. And we definitely couldn't get on the VPN, which would have been a great one for us. So we went back into that app that we did have access to. We found a bunch of old docs that pointed towards legacy Citrix virtual environments. And then we noticed through a lot of experience, it seems like a lot of legacy health software uses Citrix. We've seen it for 20 years. Sometimes things get stuck in the technology and don't move forward. I know there's a lot of now cloud native EHR out there that is not deployed in Citrix, but we've seen it a lot. The app disclosed every customer, site, and Salesforce contact, and pointed out that the docs pointed out that the username format was some concatenation of customer, site, and Salesforce contact. So we put all this together with what the app disclosed and used this new format in a username validation bug in Citrix. Again, just something in Citrix that allowed us to discern a valid username from an invalid one. And we knew we had the format right based on those responses, so we started a password spray. We were successful with several accounts, and we were able to access Citrix, right? So we went into Citrix. Again, we're looking to escape Citrix and get to a command prompt to do further damage. And we found a file import functionality in the Citrix published app that opened up a file explorer. In Citrix, that file explorer is actually on the Citrix box. It's just displayed on the screen to use if it's yours. And then we tried various Citrix escapes to, get us to command.exe or PowerShell.exe, various key combos that can, bypass hardening and things like that. But they put some effort into this Citrix instance, which we've run into before. So we bypassed those hardenings by creating a shortcut, which it did allow us to do, to the folder that contains PowerShell.exe. Then we copied the PowerShell exe to the users folder and renamed it, to something else.exe or anything but PowerShell.exe. We ran that. Now we've got a system prompt on the Citrix server. And now it's time to use that to pivot into the internal network, right? Last time we used like a SOX proxy to talk back to our listener. In this case, the Citrix server had the SSH client installed, and that's as good as gold for us because we can create from Citrix a reverse dynamic SSH tunnel, which is just a fancy word of saying that we can connect a tunnel back to our listener, and then on that listener with our tooling, we can go back the other way through the tunnel and attack the internal network. From there, we're looking to escalate our privileges. This client was comfortable with quite a bit further exploitation than some of these other scenarios were. More typical of what we try to push our customers to let us kind of take these to the end if they're willing, because they become pretty revealing. So they had Active Directory certificate services deployed, and we found 2 endpoints with EPA and HTTPS disabled. And if you look up ADCS, there's like 16 privilege escalation vectors that use various misconfigurations in Active Directory certificate services to allow a normal user to become like a domain admin. So we found the controls that would stop this. EPA and HTTPS were disabled on the enrollment endpoints, and we enumerated the available enrollment templates, and there was one called Domain Controller, which is a default cert enrollment template intended for domain controllers to use. And so the second thing we noticed, this is where it gets a little hairy. So we have our inbound tunneling from our attacking machine to the internal network. And we noticed that the network allowed outbound TCP 445 SMB access. This is not common to allow that kind of traffic out because it has no business. It's dangerous. We'll show you why. So with all that set up, we used a basic low privilege user account to do what's called a coercion against a DC. Again, from our attack box through the SSH tunnel, hitting the internal domain controller, causing it to authenticate back to our public listener over the internet outside the SOX channel. And when we received that on our listener, we relayed it back through the SSH tunnel to the Active Directory certificate endpoint. effectively gaining a certificate for the domain controller's machine account. Sounds like a lot, but all it means is with a certificate for a domain controller machine account, we now are in control of every user, password, inbox, file share, database, workstation, server, whatever you have. We can get into the CEO's inbox, the CFO's inbox, whatever machine we want to get into, we can get into. And this is when testing stopped, because there really is no further to go besides, deploy a bunch of ransomware to every machine with domain admin privileges, which we would never do, of course, but this would be the optimal scenario. Most ransomware attacks don't have near this level of access and privilege and are still pretty terrifying. I can't imagine what it would be like to unleash something like that with write access to every file share and workstation and server, and unlimited rights. So most complicated chain, I saved it to the end. I hope I wasn't in the weeds too much on that, but it might bring it back a little bit when we go over the remediations for these things, or my perception on what I would do if I were this company to help stop this along the way. Number one, they did an external network pen test, and we found this before they'd been breached. So they got to see this, in a test environment with people they trust and have NDAs signed with, rather than, someone who has their worst intentions in mind. Number two, we ran into this before. Don't respond differently in your login responses based on username validity. There should be no perceptible difference in content. You shouldn't be responding with invalid username or valid username, or taking longer on one than another. Again, this would have helped us not be able to validate our usernames against that endpoint. That application we happened to run across that we broke into, it wasn't an app pen test. It was an entire external network pen test. We know that if you left out web apps, you'd be doing the client a huge disservice, because a lot of the coolest stuff we do start with a really cool web app, exploit that we're able to transfer to other systems that the client wouldn't have been able to think was possible, right? So that particular app would have been a great candidate to do a targeted app pen test, focused on just that app outside of the entire network of other things. And we always tell people, again, I'll harp on this. You should not be having to pay us to test your commercial apps that you've bought. That should be on the developers. But if you've homegrown your apps, given that you're a health org, not a developer or software developer company, you should look at them with a side eye a little bit, be a little bit worried. I mean, if the app doesn't have anything sensitive and isn't connected to sensitive, maybe I wouldn't waste my pen testing budget on it. In this case, with a homegrown app full of PHI, yeah, probably with authentication to Active Directory and the ramifications of how we're able to reuse any credentials we have, it's a great candidate to do a little pen testing targeting on that app. Again, this thing didn't have MFA on it, but it was full PHI. General rule on that is if it's got sensitive features or functionality, it should have MFA, just like your email, just like your VPN does. And the other deciding factor is if this thing authenticates to your corporate identity provider, in this case Active Directory, but could be anything, could be Okta, could be whatever. Remember, those accounts are often reusable across your perimeter. So, preventing people from getting access to the apps is a good call to have MFA on those types of apps. We run into don't publish your username list in apps, if at all avoidable. We were able to put together, just through documentation, the site ID, the format of the username, concatenate it together. We would never have guessed that without breaking into that app, getting the docs and reading them. Enforce secure MFA enrollment. You're gonna see a lot of this. It's like I said before, we do this everywhere, not just hospitals. It's the same stuff, just different consequences. So again, just remember that if you have an enrollment for MFA and it only requires a username and password and it's public to the internet, it's as good as no MFA at all. Someone's going to just enroll. I'll, hate to repeat verbiage, but, just watch that Citrix stuff. If you have apps deployed there, if you notice some of the commercial apps you've bought deploy in Citrix, ask your provider when they plan on migrating away and doing a cloud native, browser based standard publishing of their EHR, whatever app it is. Enable MSEPA, that's extended protection authentication everywhere. It's especially important. A lot of people don't know about it. Depending on how old your environment is, it might not be on by default. We're talking, enable it on anywhere it's enableable if you can, especially Active Directory certificate enrollment services, because we target those to enroll as other users and escalate privileges and things that we've talked about, before in that scenario. And a huge one again was you shouldn't be allowing outbound NetBIOS and 445 out, because if I can initiate an attempt to access a file share to an attacker, it will send authentication credentials across, and we can either crack those on our cracking rig or do what we did in this case, relay them back to vulnerable targets like Active Directory certificate services. In fact, we're not sure what we would have done with the position we were in with the SSH tunnel in, how we would have gotten that hash, right? So it really helped out, even though it's like a pretty generic, recommendation to, restrict your outbound firewall stuff to web, email, things that are normal, that don't come with the risk of allowing SMB access outbound. So I didn't pay attention to the time at all. I hope I may have gone a little long, and I've just been stuck in this one screen. So I'm sorry if I missed the chat, but are there any questions?
Yeah, Jake, I've been monitoring the chat in the Q&A, and we don't have any, but I think you were very thorough. You did a great job covering a lot of material. Here is one that came in. Can you speak on Microsoft's recent recommendation to remove forced 30, 60, 90-day password changes? It seems that other HIPAA regulations still recommend it, so it seems it's becoming confusing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So the impetus to that recommendation is, you've heard me talk about seasonality and passwords, autumn 2025, exclamation mark, all these things are our first guess at someone's password. And a lot of that comes from a 90-day rotational window where, seasons kind of come in quarters. So it, makes sense that every 3 months you might pick the season you're in, gets kind of predictable. Same goes for 60 and 30 days. You can find something that occurs in your life every month or every 60 days that's also predictable by an adversary. And so I think it's good guidance, but it, like everything, it gets complicated and needs context. So I think you can avoid that if you're able to implement ban listing. And, like I said, like anything that has any connotation with a season should just be disallowed when you try to change your password. And in that way, I know it gets confusing when you have regulations pointing you this way and then common sense advice pointing you another, and you want to do what you think's the secure thing, but you are tied to whatever HIPAA tells you in your all's case. So I'm empathetic to that. And I think you can get the best of both worlds if you keep your interval password change, but you ban your company name, you go through your wiki, and you go through your internal culture, and you find those words that people do and use, and you try to implement ban listing. And I'll throw this out there. Implementing password ban listing is easier if you're Entra or Azure based, because it's supported by default. If you're still stuck with legacy AD that's not connected to Entra, hybrid, or anything like that, it's very hard. There's a bunch of commercial solutions. I'm not sure how well they are, because they're hard to implement and that they touch every machine. They can break things. So I will mention, if you happen to be lucky enough to be cloud native. That stuff's there for you already. If you're dragging along legacy technology, it's not your fault. You're a 100-year-old, 200-year-old organization. You've had internet access before anyone else and the systems that came with it, and you may be stuck with Active Directory internal. There are password ban list commercial solutions for that. I'd check them out. Maybe the landscape has changed a little bit and they're easier to implement, but I'd say that's the best. If I could choose anything from complexity to the frequency of changes, I would focus on a ban list. And if you're ever curious about your password security hygiene, firms like us and others do password security audits. So we take all the hashes from your domain controller, we crack them on our rig and give it a solid amount of time to chew through them. And then we can give you either, the usernames and passwords and stats on who was weak and who needs re-educated, to if you're a little queasy about getting your usernames, passwords, and a report, we can just give you the usernames and what was wrong with their passwords instead of the password itself. Like, this user had a seasonal password, this user had a company name password, this user had your corporate address as a password. It's a lot of work, but you can force password changes then on the users have weak passwords, and then you can kind of touch them up with an email saying, hey, your password came up as weak during a recent audit. Here's 5 bullet points, some of the same stuff I talked to about setting secure passwords. So not to drone on, but that's a good question.
Well, Jake, we can't thank you enough. A very thorough presentation. I want people to know that Chris will share the PowerPoint with you. But Jake, excellent presentation. Penetration testing. I know I learned a lot just listening to what you went through. Now, I'm not very IT savvy, but I still picked up some really good points. So I want to thank you for that. I want to thank Konica Minolta, and I want to thank all the people that tuned in. And remember, even if you missed it, if you registered, you will get the recording. So this is being recorded and shared. So on behalf of the Hospital Council, Jake, excellent presentation, and we'll conclude at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much.